Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video of myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, second part there for the 25th of November 2024. And we're going to start with the it's a couple of years old, problem of US against EU or European funding for support for Ukraine. And this is going to be super important to make sure that we are accurate in understanding, considering there's going to be a changeover of the administration from January the 20th. And you are going to hear an awful lot of people talk about how Europe need to pick up the pace of their support for Ukraine, that Europe aren't paying enough, that America's paying the lion's share of support for Ukraine, and they've done this and they've done that, etc., etc. Shashank Joshi from The Economist says, checking in on the Kiel tracker, Europe has provided around 40% more in allocated aid to Ukraine than the US. If I were the EU, I'd use a chunk of the peace facility to print this on mobile billboards driving in loops around the White House on January the 20th. So interesting, this, where you've got Europe having a total allocated aid of 118.2 billion, with aid yet to be allocated, and this is only up to August the 31st, by the way, of 74.1 billion of further euros. And for the US, we have 84.7 billion euros having been allocated, with a slight tad more, sort of 15 billion yet to be allocated. Now, there are still questions over, pledges and stuff getting there. So being allocated is all good and well. Yeah, we will give you this. We've allocated this funding for that. But actually, it might be several years before you get this bit of kit, or 6 months, or whatever it is. And, we hear about delays at the moment with some of the aid that Germany is pledged in terms of, say, MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, and so on and so forth. So yeah, and then there are questions about whether Europe is able to pick up the pace of their support, given that there will be a very stark decision to be made on January the 20th or thereabouts. If the US decides to withdraw from supporting Ukraine, then Europe will have to decide whether they are going to continue to do so, or whether they will go down the appeasement path as well. So lots still to work out, but it is clear to me, at least, that Europe has paid their fair share, comparatively speaking. Now, the difference between Europe and the US is that the US has these vast stockpiles of equipment that they can give through presidential drawdown authority that no other nation has, because of underfunding of armed forces, or you could argue not wasting so much in building all this stuff and then stockpiling it where it sort of gathers desert sand. However you want to interpret that, the situation is that the US is in a privileged position whereby it can provide immediate help to Ukraine in a way that no other nation properly can. And so Ukraine need the US big time. Europe need the US to help big time, and the US need to help because it's within it's for their own strategic interests to do so. Whether they will or not remains to be seen. Right, moving on. Lithuania has delivered a new military aid package, including generators, M113, that's APC, spare parts, weapons and ammunition, and that's according to the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. Good news there. Now, Ukraine is developing guided aerial bombs domestically, according to the Chief of Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Staff. We have heard this before, but it's always good to hear it again. Quote, we are actively working on it. I think we will achieve such success. I mean, the question is when. They need to be able to use these guided glide bombs as frequently as the Russians do. It does seem that they are using them at least somewhat at the moment. I do see video evidence of the Ukrainians using guided glide bombs, but of course the Russians use them so much. I don't know about last month or so, whether they are using them as much as they were, say, 3 or 4 months ago. Maybe not. I don't know if things have changed with air advantage, with the number of airframes that Russia can use, with the threats to airfields, with ATACMS and Storm Shadows and whatnot. I don't know whether there's been a behavioural change in the use of the aircraft that deliver those guided glide bombs for the Russians. Now, there is a drone coalition. We have these capability coalitions that are arranged with allied nations giving aid to Ukraine in certain domains. Well, the drone coalition is to allocate 1.8 billion euros to the Ukrainians, or for the Ukrainians, next year. Or it says this year. I presume that means going forward for the next year rather than until the end of December. So in 6 weeks, 1.8 billion euros will be spent on drones. Well, that'd be very nice. Thank you very much. But I presume that's for a year. But really good news that a large amount of money is being set aside for drones, because drones are that important. Now, Ukraine's strike potential concerning drones, or maybe missiles as well, has expanded by 2,000 kilometers. Now, if that's a correct preposition, instead of 2,000 kilometers, by 2,000 kilometers means that 2,000 kilometers above what was previously the strike potential. That's according to the intelligence, Ukrainian intelligence. Ukrainian armed forces are using ATACMS missiles alongside combined attack drones, including the latest Lithuanian drone. But yeah, I don't know. It makes more sense if 2,000 is the kind of maximum range, because we haven't seen that so far. We've been talking about sort of 1,000. Then there were claims that actually drone had struck at 1,600 kilometers. So you could be up to, well, you're to at least 2,000 kilometers now, which is going to give you an awful lot of Russia to target. Now we have the Ukraine's largest FPV drone makes history with the first ever assault rifle combat use. I thought we'd seen this before, but this is evidently a Wild Hornets drone, which is fantastic. Queen of Hornets now wields an AK-47 in a war that is increasingly defined by the use of drones. It's a first ever combat use. It helped finish off Russian infantry after FPV drones destroyed an armoured column. Wow. So, you know, you'd rather send in a machine like this to go and shoot at enemies rather than send in troops to a very dangerous area. Interesting. Now, Ambassador Bridget Brink, the US ambassador to Ukraine, says as Russia tries to take down Ukraine's energy grid with relentless missile and drone attacks, the US, through US aid, has delivered 12 transformers to frontline distribution operators. These transformers will provide reliable electricity for 45,000 plus frontline residents. This is going to be super important for the continued supply of energy to people all over Ukraine. And when you've got a potentially very difficult winter to contend with, that is going to be welcome news. Now, War Translated Dimitri says the EU and the US government allocates $112 million in a similar vein to DTEK. So they are the private energy company that's had many of its energy facilities absolutely hammered. So they are getting $112 million from the EU and US governments to restore energy infrastructure damaged by numerous Russian attacks. Of this amount, $63 million is provided by the European Commission and 46 by the US government. Until now, all the restoration work has been financed by Akhmetov's DTEK exclusively at its own expense. Wow, more than $1.2 billion over the entire duration of the war. The Russian military attacks destroyed 90% of the company's generating facilities. That is insane. Absolutely insane. Wow. Okay, so Benjamin Tallis now reporting that it's absolutely clear from Kaja Sallongren. So Kaja Sallongren is the Dutch former defence minister at what looks like the Security Conference of Chatham House, is it? Institute for Security Policy, something. Anyway, a conference in Berlin, the CH Europe conference in Berlin, on the challenges for European defence and how to meet them. We have to spend more, we have to move faster, and we have to innovate and adapt. Absolutely, I don't think there's anything to disagree with there. It's pretty obvious in my books, but yep, good to hear that's claimed explicitly. More needs to be done and quicker. Now, we're going to start talking about the application of outside troops and maintenance officials inside Ukraine. So France has reportedly dropped its block. But first, actually, before we get there, here is a segue. France has reportedly dropped its block on allowing non-EU companies to participate in the European Defence Investment Plan, with up to 35% of funds now allowed to go to companies outside the bloc's 27 member states. So if you remember, France was one of these countries that was not happy, I think it was France and Greece, not happy with funds going outside of the EU funds to purchase things like the Czech initiative, for example. I think the French were being very difficult with that, as were as I mentioned, the Greeks, saying that we want to make sure that all of these artillery rounds come from within the EU, so that EU money stays in the EU and money multiplies, etc., etc. But then the reality hit that actually the EU was completely unable to produce all of those shells themselves, and so they had to procure them from outside the EU. So EU money would have to go outside the EU. So in general, France has been against that, and now they said actually for the European Defence Investment Plan, up to 35% of the funds can go outside of the 27-member bloc. So Sweden is one of those countries that pushed for this to happen, as it is heavily invested in the UK-based BAE. So this is interesting, where the UK has been outside of the EU. We actually fall foul of these EU decisions, which is why BAE is probably heavily invested in the EU, with having its own entities set up there. But in general, for any UK production, we won't see that European money. Well, actually, we might see some of that money now, because the EU are bending the rules. The plan is, however, far from finalised, with the final draft to be submitted for voting next year. So that's still some way off. Now, this is a segue into talking about French troops possibly on the ground in Ukraine. Discussions on sending troops to Ukraine have resumed in Europe, reports Le Monde. Sources say talks about deploying Western forces and private defence companies have intensified, especially after Trump's election win. So Le Monde, Trump's re-election revives talks in Europe on sending military personnel to Ukraine. Now, Shashank Joshi from The Economist again says growing discussion in European capitals of the possibility of troop deployments. Estonian Foreign Minister publicly raised the idea a week ago, but my understanding is no one has yet looked into the issue in concrete detail, calculating how many troops needed, what capabilities and what cost, etc. Before we go and look at what he has to say, this is Mark Urban on the 25th. So he writes for the Sunday Times, says UK and France could send troops to Ukraine, according to Le Monde today, citing talks between them about how to deal with the incoming Trump administration. My interpretation could be three scenarios. If the Russian troops broke through and were heading for Kiev, very unlikely, but Macron has suggested something along these lines before, as part of plans to strengthen disengagement under any ceasefire deal, and to train new Ukrainian army formations after an armistice, as they did before February 2022. So it could be just training in the West. It could be getting troops to do stuff in the West, so that Ukrainian troops in the West can move towards the front line. And it could be also to get actually engaged if Russian troops did a massive breakthrough. Now, here he mentions Kiev, but actually Macron mentioned Odessa quite a lot previously, which is, I don't know if that's more likely than Kiev. Anyway, going back to Shashank Joshi, one big question, he says, is troops from where? So CEE allies would not want removal of EFP forces to put into Ukraine. Chris Cavoli would not want his NATO reserves being sent. The second big question is how far Trump administration would go in providing backing for a European force, e.g. air defense. So it's very unlikely the American troops would be committed to this, hearing the rhetoric that we've had actually from both sides in the US. Biden said, we're not sending troops, and Trump is dead against that. But would they support those troops with NATO air defense? I don't know. When I say air defense, I mean airplanes helping to defend those troops, maybe. A third question is whether this would be open-ended, e.g. to enforce a deal or time-bound to allow Ukraine forces to build up over time and be properly trained and armed without pressures of an active front line. Fourth question is where they would go. European troops in far west of Ukraine to serve as a distant overwatch force, as a forward tripwire up to current front lines, unlikely, or in between, e.g. Kiev and west of Dnipro, or to turn key cities into sanctuaries. Fifth is cost. How much would this cost and who would pay for it? Would Europeans plunder Ukrainian frozen Russian assets? would they plunder Russian frozen sovereign assets to underwrite such a commitment? German brigade in Lithuania, for instance, is thought to cost 5 to 7 billion euros. A brigade in Ukraine would cost more. As in February 2022, no NATO allies keen on being directly at war with Russia. Unlike in February 22, allies now judge this relative to alternatives: a Ukrainian defeat, ceasefire with no guarantees, ceasefire with indirect guarantees, e.g. continued aid, or NATO. Probability of European troops inside Ukraine is relatively low, but plausible. The Trump admin will raise the issue and ask for it. Can imagine a package deal whereby Europe does things previously off the table in terms of spending and risk in exchange for assured US involvement. So it could be that US continues to provide some of the ammunition and whatnot for Ukraine, while European troops are the ones that go into Ukraine. So, yeah, interesting thoughts to be had there. Now, the main contractor for the Ministry of Armed Forces, which oversees French arms export contracts and the transfer of related military know-how, would be willing to continue training Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine, as it already does in France and Poland. So these are kind of subcontracted entities, French entities, one presumes here, who have said, yeah, we're happy to go and train Ukrainian troops in Ukraine if that's what you want us to do. So the French could well be considering that. The US, interestingly, has already allowed contractors to go in now, which is a bold move for the Americans, because actually they don't even allow their commanders to go and meet in Kiev, whereas, say, the British, we allow Tony Radakin to go to Kiev and meet his counterparts and whatnot, and it's that communication that can take place within Ukraine. But the Americans don't allow that, but they are now allowing maintenance contractors and whatnot to go in, work on the F-16s and similar, it appears. Now, Halbach, who is the Green Party economics minister? I think he's a Green Party. Anyway, in a coalition, says Germany was always too late in helping Ukraine. He's criticised Scholz's hesitancy on arms deliveries, saying decisions came too late for those suffering in Ukraine. He stressed the urgency of quickly supplying Taurus. Now, it's interesting that Olaf Scholz has now been voted in as the leader who will lead the SDP to the next election. They are the centre-left party who've been in coalition, but now there's been this vote of confidence called. It's looking like there'll be an election probably in February next year, and instead of having the much more popular defence minister Boris Pistorius at the head of the party, he seems to have dropped out, and they are endorsing pretty unanimously, I think, Olaf Scholz for the job. So yeah, I don't fancy the SDP's chances. Right, Shashank Joshi again saying in response to this Guardian piece, Trump Pentagon pick attacks the UN and NATO and urges the US to ignore Geneva Conventions. Okay, so you've got Pete Hegseth, who might find it quite difficult. I was watched an analysis that was looking at, there's a Republican, I think, senator who's a female former lieutenant colonel or something in the armed forces, something like that. Anyway, you've got a bit of pushback for Pete Hegseth because he said there should be no women in combat duties for the armed forces. They just signed a deal to get rid of straight away, I think, as an executive order, as soon as Trump gets in, that there should be no transgender in the US armed forces. The problem with saying things like that sound all, yeah, okay, anti-woke, brilliant, let's do this, let's get the armed forces back to what it was in the 1990s or whatever, wherever your heyday was. The problem is, like I've said before, with females in the armed forces is, the US needs boots on the ground, right? And when you're at a point, as all of our nations are, in terms of, we're in 2024 now, not everyone wants to don a uniform and go and fight for your country. We have a youth that isn't so inspired to do that. And as a result, you have to broaden your recruitment demographics. So that's why women are very useful, because actually it's practically important that you have more people to choose from. Now, if that executive order, goes through and gets turned into policy, then you've got, there are some estimates that there are 15,000 transgender people in the US Army, in the US Armed Forces. Well, that's an awful lot of people you're suddenly kicking out. And there's probably going to be a lot of legal cases. There's going to be, it's going to be quite costly maybe. But you're going to lose 15,000 people. If that's the case, you need to find 15,000 people from somewhere else. So these things might sound quite, yeah, okay, I'm really conservative on these issues and blah, blah, blah. But think about the practicalities as well. That's really important. I'm trying not to cast my opinion on this, just to look at it from pure practicalities. Now, Shashank Joshi says, I have increasing doubts that Hegseth will be confirmed. And this is what I'm saying, because actually you've got people like the aforementioned, I think, Republican senator, female armed forces, who is dead against his position on female combat operatives in the armed forces. And there are a number of people in the Senate, not so much a House of Representatives, because a lot of them had come in. You go on 2-year cycles, so you had all the people were up for election in November, on November the 5th, and most of them would be coming, a lot of them, sorry, will be coming in on the kind of coattails of Trump. So you get a lot of MAGA House of Representatives lawmakers, but a lot of the senators will be much more old school because they're up every 6 years, and they just seem to be much more serious about governing and not, on the whims of these cultural things. Although there's some of that still, but it's potentially going to be quite difficult to get some of these picks through, even though Matt Gaetz has given up. You could be that gives permission to others. So the people in the firing line are Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth particularly, and RFK Jr., but there's a whole suite of them really. But those are the 3 main ones that are looking pretty dodgy. Yeah. So, quote, the defense of Europe is not our problem. So the reason I'm talking about this in this section is because if you're talking about aid to Ukraine, if this guy does get in, Pete Hegseth, and you're wondering whether there'll be continued aid to Ukraine, like military aid. I talked yesterday about people overlook these aid packages that go consistently from the US. Like the last one was $275 million worth of like HIMARS ammunition, 105 and 155 mil shells, so on and so forth. All of these things that are like not so exciting. It's not like Bradley IFVs or Abrams tanks or this or that. But if they don't get those regular kind of, scare quotes, boring military aid packages, they're going to be screwed. That is the bread and butter of the stuff they need on a regular basis. Now, Pete Hegseth is coming in and saying the defense of Europe is not our problem. Been there, done that twice. He writes, adding, quote, NATO is a relic and should be scrapped and remade in order for freedom to be truly defended. So you've got a guy that's not sounding like he's going to want to help defend Europe, but he's also wanting to scrap NATO. You've got Trump that doesn't really understand alliances and doesn't like NATO. The future of NATO is hanging in a balance, you could argue, and that is the future of global security. And if that's the case, that's the end of the US being at the top of the global hegemonic ladder, as I keep warning. That kind of isolationism is, if you think you're going to have America first, I know America first is like, we want to put all our resources into America. Yeah, fair enough. But if you don't invest in the world out there, then don't expect to get anything back from that. You've got to speculate to accumulate. And if you want the US, if you want your people to be shouting USA, USA, in a kind of way that means something, like the USA means something internationally and globally and is a force to be reckoned with around the world, you need to be spreading your wings somewhat. Now, that's fair enough not to, but just understand that comes with consequences. So that isolationism where Europe's not our problem, okay, well, in that case, nothing around the world's your problem, really. Like, Europe is as much your problem as anywhere else around the world, because you do an immense amount of trade with Europe. And if Europe starts becoming more and more under the influence of Russia, and you lose purchase in Europe, and you put tariffs up, then you are just going to hide behind your walls over there and not interact, and you will become a shadow of your former self. So it's worrying. Okay, North Korean KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles used by Russia do contain foreign parts that were made in 2022. I've reported this before, but we've got some nice pictures to look at now. And here, apparently, we have evidence that you've got modern components in these North Korean missiles. These missiles supplied by North Korea include components from China, the US, Japan, the UK, Switzerland, So according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia reportedly received around 100 of these ballistic missiles. But of course, they can use 100 North Korean ballistic missiles and no one in the Trump administration or Joe Rogan, they don't say anything. But as soon as Ukraine fires 20 ATACMS into Russia, all hell breaks loose. Oh, woe is, oh my goodness, Biden administration, blah, blah, blah. Hang on. 100 North Korean missiles? What you got to say about that? Oh, nothing. How convenient. How convenient. Right. Now, interesting bit of data. I'm going to have a look at this again tomorrow in the hits and losses video. But Wild Hornets and other FPV interceptors have reduced enemy Lancet drone strikes by 75%. This is an incredible bit of data. You have Russian Lancers, and I've talked about how Lancers have been really, really effective. Although I have been pointing them out on loss lists, I haven't. To be honest, we went through a period where I was like, oh, Lancers are back, and it was probably this June, July, August period where I was saying, oh, look, Lancers are back. We're getting loads of Lancers on these loss lists, and I then probably didn't really realise that although you still get them every day, there weren't like 6-10 Lancet strikes on these loss lists every single day, and that is because interceptor drones have come in, and not only are they taking out these Orlan 10s and Orlan 30s and Zalas and Supercams, these reconnaissance drones, but they're taking out, it appears, Lancet drones as well. And that is an incredible success rate. I mean, look at November, where, okay, we've got another 5 or 6 days left, but that's an incredible dip there going on. And as mentioned, that's 20 compared to 180 is more than 75% dip, I can tell you. But compared to October, that is a 75% dip, maybe even more actually. So that's a really good result, I think, and the Ukrainians doing a really good job to try and take out those kind of medium range reconnaissance and strike drones. Really, really good news there. Now, talking about North Korea as we were previously, they are apparently expanding a factory to produce missiles used by Russia and Ukraine. So there's KN-23, KN-24. I'm pretty sure that that's what's being discussed here. And you can see that you've got this factory that is seen on satellite imagery, and they're expanding that key weapons production complex that assembles short-range missiles used by Russia in Ukraine. Researchers at an American think tank concluded, based on satellite imagery, the facility known as the February 11 plant is part of the Ryongsong machinery complex in Hamhun, North Korea's second largest city on the country's east coast. Sam Lair, a research fellow at the James Martin Center, CNS, said that the plant is the only known manufacturer of Hwasong 11 solid fuel rockets. Satellite images taken in early October by commercial satellite company Planet Labs appear to show an additional assembly building under construction, as well as new housing complex likely for workers, according to an analysis by CNS researchers. Quote, "We take this as an indication that they are significantly increasing the capacity of this facility." This is worrying for Ukraine because, as I've said before, potentially the North Korean soldiers are a game changer. If they can get more than 11,000, if they can get 100,000 troops, then that is a big change, because Russia won't have to do a mass national mobilization. They're just doing it by proxy through North Korea. Now, if North Korea can continue to provide self-propelled guns and multiple launch rocket systems and missiles and rockets, then my goodness, Ukraine has to contend with that too. That's a real challenge. Right, final thing to say is we can assist Ukraine a little bit if you are in Britain, particularly. Apparently, so train driver Dave tells me on Blue Sky, Lidl. Well, actually, you can in many countries in Europe where Lidl is a German supermarket chain that's set up in the UK as well. They are selling Ukrainian wine. And so I need to get myself to a Lidl. It's not particularly convenient to me, but when I go into town, I should be able to do that. And I hope at my local Lidl they do, because I'll be made up. I like my wine, and I was drinking some Georgian wine recently from my local wine shop, and it was absolutely lush. Georgia, interestingly, is the earliest wine produced by humanity. Is known to come from Georgia, so it has a rich history of viticulture. It would be great if I can get some wine from Lidl. I'm quite excited about that. Anyway, kind of irrelevant for my American viewers, but hey ho. Take care, y'all. I look forward to speaking to you soon. Toodle pips.